morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker today. Professor Islam Dayeh is Assistant Professor at the Seminar for Semitic and Arabic Studies at Freie University of Berlin. He's a specialist in Arabic and Islamic Studies and Islamic Intellectual History with various specializations, including the Qur'an, history of its interpretation, Muslim-Jewish relations, among many. Professor Dayeh has led many research projects, including the very important Philologie, revisiting the canons of textual scholarship. And also he's the founding editor of the Brill journal, Philological Encounters. As a matter of fact, if you have an article and you're looking for a journal, I would advise you to send it there. The turnout, I was assured by Islam, is very swift. And now this talk is based on a soon-to-appear chapter in a new edited volume, which is edited by Professor Dayeh and Professor Angelica Neuwirth with the title Prefiguration and Fulfillment in the Quran and its Biblical Milieu. Islam, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Johanna and Majid, for this kind invitation. I've been following the talks, not always live, but I'm glad that you post them on YouTube and so that everyone could watch them and learn from them afterwards. And I'm very happy that Walid is the moderator, and particularly since Walid's work is fundamental, really, for the presentation I'm about to give. He's been working on a key figure in the history of, or in this very small but growing field of Ḥarāllī scholarship through his work on Burhan al-Din al-Biqai, which I'll be talking about briefly.
Islam, could you go into presentation mode? Because at the moment we see all the, menu bars and so on. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Okay, good. So, yeah, so what I'd like to do today is, since the topic is quite immense, I'd like to focus on basically introduce al-Ḥarāllī's work and some of the basic ideas that we find in his writings. I will talk a little bit also about the history of the reception, al-Biqā'i's engagement to a certain degree, maybe towards the end. But I will be focusing mostly on al-Ḥarāllī's work. Now, how did I come to this topic? Like Walid, actually, probably even through, what's happening here? Okay. As I was working on Burhan al-Din al-Biqā'i's tafsir and reading it a while ago, it's quite striking that al-Biqā'i, in his famous tafsir Nazm al-Durar fi Tanasub al-Ayy wal-Suwar, which has been studied now by Walid Saleh and others, Walid in his work has been focusing on a very important aspect of al-Biqā'i's work, namely his quotations from biblical texts. Other scholars have been interested in al-Biqā'i's theory of tanasub or munasabat, that is the relations between the verses and between the surah. So in the introduction, we find that there's a clear reference by al-Biqā'i to the work of al-Ḥasan al-Ḥarāllī. Now, al-Ḥarāllī, I should mention briefly, he was born in Marrakesh came from an Andalusian family that was born in Marrakesh, and he studied in al-Maghrib and then in Bijaya and in Tunis in various disciplines, including tasawwuf and grammar and philosophy. And then he traveled east, like many Moroccan or Maghribi scholars of his time, and he lived for a while in Medina, We'll talk about this episode in a moment. And then in Cairo, and then he returned back to the west, to the Maghrib, where he spent about 5 years in Bijaya, which is today in Algeria, and then returned again to the east. I spent a little bit of time in Cairo, and then in Hama, in modern-day Syria, where he died. And he died around 1240 or 1239, I believe. We don't have an exact birth date. Now, so what is interesting about al-Ḥarāllī is that until, more or less, until the 1970s Hyderabad edition of Burhan al-Din al-Biqai's work, modern scholars did not really engage with Ḥarāllī's work. We basically didn't have the sources. It was thanks to that edition that in the 1970s, I believe early 1970s, that scholars, especially Moroccan scholars, started to become aware of the presence of al-Ḥarāllī's works in al-Biqai. And this led, this scholar in 1997, Muhammadi al-Khayyati, to take an interest in Ḥarāllī's work and produce for the first time a critical edition of the 3 theoretical texts that I'll be talking about shortly, that al-Biqai mentions in his in that opening statement. Here he says that I came across this Miftah al-Bab al-Muqfal li Fahm al-Qur'an al-Munazzal, and its Urwa, and another work called at-Tawshiyah wa at-Tawfiyah, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then he also refers to the tafsir, which he made use of extensively in his own commentary. So we have this work, this very important edition, Miftah al-Bab al-Muqfal, the 3 treatises, followed by number 4, as you can see, Nusus min tafsirihi al-Mafqud. What this scholar basically did was he went to the tafsir of Nazm al-Durar, this 22 volume work, and he extracted all the quotations, Biqai's quotations of al-Ḥarāllī's tafsir. And he brought them together in this one volume, which is about almost 700 pages long. More recently, the same author came out with this important work. It's a study of al-Ḥarāllī's exegetical methods and tafsir work. Now, we don't have the tafsir, and it seems to be lost. Even in the 14th and 15th century, references to the tafsir that I'll talk about if you wish in the Q&A, people talk about the tafsir, they've heard about it, but it seems that very few commentators actually saw the tafsir. And there's even doubt whether al-Ḥarāllī actually completed the tafsir. So, and more recently, I should mention, for those of you who are interested in the biographical account or study of al-Ḥarāllī, recently Faris Casewood defended or completed his dissertation on al-Ḥarāllī's spiritual and intellectual biography. It's a fascinating work, and it covers his journeys east and west and the encounters he had and his students and teachers. So it's a very, very important work for scholars who want to look at the sources, the intellectual sources of al-Ḥarāllī's thought. Now, so al-Ḥarāllī composes 3 rasail, which he considers are the usul of, or he even calls them al-qawaneen, qawaneen al-fahm. The first one, Fahm al-Qur'an, the first one is called Miftah al-Bab al-Muqfal li Fahm al-Qur'an al-Munazzal, the key of the closed gate to understanding the revealed Qur'an. And notice here the centrality of the term fahm, not tafsir, not ta'wil, fahm, and we'll come to that in a moment. And this treatise is about, in the edited version, is about 20-25 pages long. This is followed by the support, Al-Kitab Al-Urwa, للمفتاح الفاتح للباب المقفل. And the third work is the embellishment and completion, Kitab At-Tawshiyah Wat-Tawfiyah. So let's go to the first work. The first work, which is the key of the closed, or to the closed gate, Miftah al-Bab al-Muqfal. In the introduction, al-Ḥarāllī mentions that this book is the purpose of writing this book is to provide the reader with qawaneen, laws, axioms, you could say, that could help and guide the reader of the Quran to achieve or acquire the best fahm. And you could already notice I already mentioned that fahm, that al-Ḥarāllī distinguishes in that risala between three different activities. Tafsir, ta'wil, and fahm. And a tafsir for him is governed by the rules of nahu and ulum al-lugha, philology. That is the realm of tafsir. And tafsir is linked to ifsah and fasaha. Ta'wil is also governed by the rules of kalam and iman. And he says that scholars have paid sufficient attention to qawaneen al-tafsir and qawaneen al-ta'wil, but that no one has written a work in the realm of the qawaneen al-fahm, which for him, as we will see, is something much broader and more total in its parts. And he refers to a certain Moroccan scholar who he met in Medina, Abu Abdullah al-Qurtubi, who he studied with in Medina, the qawaneen al-fahm. So I will be looking at some of these. I have to mention something, that I will be reading the primary sources. I have not provided into translation, and the reason for that al-Ḥarāllī's style is quite condensed. He is innovative in the way he weaves together vocabulary that is familiar from different fields of knowledge, Sufism, usul, fiqh, logic, etc. So I prefer to show you the primary sources rather than produce my own translation at this stage. So for example, in this excerpt, I will read it in Arabic and then highlight some of the key concepts. من تفطن إلى رتب الخطاب في القرآن. So the Quran has different layers and hierarchies of khitab. And the Quran, the entirety of the Quran is khitab. It's an address to, it's a communication to the ibad. بحسب أسماء الله وأطوار الخلق وتنزلات الأمر ورتب تنامي القلوب في الرجوع إلى الله. So here he focuses on that the Quran corresponds to different states of people, of one individual, and that the Quran uses God's names, mention of the khalq, of Sharia, etc., to address different aspects of the wad of the person or of the self. And at the end he says, حتى أن خطاب الإقبال ينتظم بخطاب الإعراض والغيبة بالحضور والاختصاص بالتعميم. And these are terms that he brings from Sufism and from rhetoric and from different fields, and particularly the concept of yantazim, and it connects to what al-Biqa'i would do later on with an-nazm, so that the khitab al-iqbal, that God comes close to the individual, yantazim bi khitab al-i'rad, that it is woven together with the opposite of that. Al-ghayba, the presence, is woven together, the absence is woven together with al-hudur, والاختصاص بالتعميم, etc. Right? So this is a key, first of all, in this qanun, that all the different parts of the Quran are interrelated. They are all connected. Okay. If we move on, coming back to the issue of ifham and it's the difference between ifham and ifsah, he says فإفهامه إصراره للقلوب الفهمة. This is إفهام الله إصراره للقلوب الفهمة, and the qalb is the locus of the fahm, whereas the sama', listening, is the locus of ifsah, and tafsir. لما قد علم من أن إفهام القرآن أضعاف إفصاحه. Okay, since we know that the ifham of the Quran, the potential of the Quran to convey understanding, أضعاف إفصاحه, that's greater than its ifsah, than its eloquence or clarity. بما لا يكاد ينتهي عده, infinitely. لذلك, and this is an interesting how he connects the tafsir with the fahm. He says لذلك يكثر فيه الخطاب عطفا, and that is why in its discourse the use of the conjunction is frequent. أي على غير مذكور, that the atf here, this is a grammatical feature, that it occurs in the Quran على غير مذكور, that there's nothing that the Quran is, you know, how the verses start with wa and thumma, and the exegetes wonder, what is the ma'tuf alayh? What is this verse? How is this verse connected to the one preceding it? And this is precisely where he says basically that this is the space for ifham. This is the room where fahm thrives. This is precisely the idea of munasabat. We can come back to this later on. In the second treatise, which is on Urwa al-Muftah, it's basically an interpretation of the famous hadith al-Ahruf al-Sab'a, a famous hadith that has been used and interpreted in different ways. There are three primary, I would say, understandings of this hadith and its variants. One that basically argues that it means that the meanings of the Quran are multiple and without defining any particular theme or how this multiplicity looks like. Another understanding is that it actually refers to the qira'at, to the ways of reading and reciting the Quran, not necessarily the 7 of Ibn Mujahid, the famous ones, but 7 nonetheless, or a number, many, abundance. In another variant of the hadith of Ibn Mas'ud, there's actually reference to themes or aspects. The hadith goes كان كتاب الأول من باب واحد على وجه واحد ونزل القرآن من 7 أبواب على 7 أحرف. That the Quran, unlike the previous scriptures, was revealed according to or manifests 7 main themes or topics, which are called harf. Zajr, admonishment, amir, command, halal wa haram, wa muhkam wa mutashabih, wa amthal. فأحلوا حلاله وحرموا حرامه وافعلوا ما أمرتم وانتهوا عما نهيتم واعتبروا بأمثاله. Notice here the word اعتبروا بأمثاله, اعتبار. واعملوا بمحكمه وآمنوا بمتشابهه وقولوا آمنا به كل من عند ربنا. So what does al-Ḥarāllī do with this famous hadith? He argues that, and this is very important for later on when we try to link al-Ḥarāllī to al-Biqā'i. He says, and I'll just summarize this because it's quite condensed in his text. He says that حرفا صلاح الدنيا So the salah of the dunya relies on the harf of al-halal wal-haram. And he says, أصلها التوراة, that the root of this harf, al-halal wal-haram, أصلها التوراة وتمامها في القرآن. And its completion or perfection is in the Quran. And then he moves on and talks about Salah al-Ma'ad, the hereafter. And he says, this is related to the harf of az-zajr wal-amr, of admonishment and commandment. And he says, أصلها في الإنجيل, that its root is in the Gospels, وتمامها في القرآن, and its perfection or its completion in the Quran. And then he says that the remaining, this number 7, يختص القرآن بالحرف الجامع المثل الأعلى. Sorry, I missed the المتشابه والمحكم. He says this is common to the Torah and Injil and the Quran. And as for the final one, which is the Alhamd, and he says this is the particular to the Quran, and he refers to the name of the Prophet Muhammad and the opening verse of the Fatiha, and he discusses also the significance of the Fatiha, that it jama'at al-huruf al-sab'a allati fi al-Quran, that it encompasses all the 7 themes or topics in the Quran, and that the Quran itself encompasses all the themes in the Torah and in the Gospel. That same idea we will find in al-Biqa'i's interpretation of Surah al-Fatiha, that the Quran encompasses يتضمن معاني التوراة والإنجيل. Okay, so moving on to the 3rd treatise, which is التوفية والتوفية. Based on that, so in the first treatise, he discusses the idea of fahm. In the second, his interpretation of al-ahruf al-sab'a and how it relates to the previous scriptures. And in the 3rd treatise, he discusses the significance or the importance of the Quranic, the narratives in the Quran. This is in one chapter. I'll read it because the vocabulary is very telling of his views. فصل توفية تشتمل على تناول كلية القرآن لكلية الأمة. So this is a chapter that deals with how the kulliyat al-Quran, the totality or the entirety of the Quran, can be applied to the kulliyat al-Ummah, to the entirety of the Ummah, and is applicable also to the reader, to the qari, who reads it min ahli al-fahm wal-iqan. And al-fahm again referring to understanding that he elaborates in the first treatise. Now, what does he mean by ummah? Kulliyat al-ummah. By ummah, he means the followers of Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, from his time until the day of judgment. So the Quran, its entirety, corresponds or is applicable to the entirety of the ummah and to every single reader, so as a collective and as an individual. But what does that actually mean? So let us read this text. صد أكثر هذه الأمة عن تفهم القرآن ظنهم أن الذي فيه من قصص الأولين وأخبار المثابين والمعاقبين من أهل الأديان أجمعين أن ذلك إنما مقصوده الإخبار والقصص فقط. كلا وليس كذلك. What prevented many of the people of this ummah, meaning the ummah of Muhammad, from understanding, again, تفهم القرآن, ظنهم, their supposition, their idea, their claim, أن الذي فيه من قصص الأولين, that the stories that it conveys of the previous people who were rewarded and punished from different religions, that إنما مقصوده الإخبار, that it was only intended for narration and for storytelling. And he objects, he says كلا وليس كذلك. إن ذلك إنما مقصوده الاعتبار والتنبؤ. What the purpose of narrating these stories is اعتبار. This is a very important concept for Ḥarāllī and for many Andalusian scholars from the 12th century onwards. And it's also very prominent in al-Biqā'i's work. والتنبؤ بمشاهدة متكررة في هذه الأمة. That the real purpose of telling or narrating these stories is to contemplate and to be alert of how these stories, by way of observation, how they recur in this ummah, in the ummah of Muhammad. من نظائر جميع أولئك الأعداد وتلك الأحوال والآثار. In terms of similarities and parallels. حتى يسمع السامع جميع القرآن من أوله إلى خاتمته, so that the listener would listen to the Quran, would listen to the entirety of the Quran منطبقا على هذه الأمة وأئمتها, that it corresponds to this ummah and its leaders, هداتها وضلالها, not only those who guided, but also those that misguided. فحينئذ ينفتح له باب الفهم ويضيء له نور العلم, etc. So this is the way to fahm. And he continues, وإذا شهد المؤمن انطباق القرآن على كلية الأمة فكان بذلك عالما. And so when the mu'min witnesses how the Quran is applicable to the entirety of the ummah, and he would by that become alim and knowing of that, ينفتح له باب ترق, and this would lead to elevation and growth, etc. فترقى سمعه إلى أن يجد جميع القرآن المنطبق على كلية الأمة منطبقا على ذاته. This will result into the awareness that this انطباق, which I translate correspondence or application, but there's probably a better word, that this also applies to his that, to his self. And this is a fascinating exploration. I think that very rare to find this kind of interest in the psychology of the reader of the Quran, the reciter. في أحوال نفسه وتقلباته وتصرفات أفعاله وازدحام خواطره حتى يسمع القرآن منطبقا عليه فينتفع بسماع جميعه ويعتبر بأي آية سمع منه. Again, so that he will continue. It's a process, and that this process of finding how the Quran relates to himself in all his different, the person, individuals, different stages and different تقلبات. What's the best way to translate تقلبات? فينتفع بسماع جميعه ويعتبر بآية أي آية سمعها منه. Again, this is the concept of اعتبار. فيطلب موقعها في نفسه. So then it becomes the way, what is required here for fahm, which is not what is expected from tafsir and ta'wil, is that the listener will then seek to find how that story is relevant, موقعها في نفسه, is relevant to that individual. فيجدها بوجه ما. So he will find a certain aspect of the story of relevance to himself, to the self. رغبة كانت أو رهبة, and then he mentions all these different binaries again. So, and then he goes on, and I will just summarize. In about 10-15 pages, he talks about 7 adyan that the Quran elaborates through its stories. These are دين الذين آمنوا, دين الذين هادوا, دين الذين قالوا إنا نصارى, دين الصابئة, دين الثانوية, دين الذين أشركوا, and دين المنافقين. And he describes each deen, each group, produces verses that refer to these groups and their characteristic. What was particularly characteristic of the الذين هادوا or الذين قالوا إنا نصارى. And then what he does is he basically says that these 7 adyan are present in the ummah of Muhammad, and they will continue to be present until the day of judgment. So among the ummah Muhammad, there are believers, but there are also sabi'ah, and there are also mushrikeen, and there are also munafiqeen. And of course, by that, he doesn't mean he's not doing any takfir or any such thing. He is looking for archetypes. So these stories of Ladina Hadu and Nasara and Sabi'ah, they are archetypes. They stand for a particular characteristic or particular behavior or inclination that you can also find among the believers or the people of the Ummah Muhammad as a collective, but also as individuals. And I'll spare you the details, but it's fascinating, and I really invite you all to read those sections of this Risala. And he ends this Risala by saying, after this detailed discussion of the Adyan and how they correspond to the Adyan to the Ummah of Muhammad, he says, فَلِذَلِكَ مِنْ حَقِّ الْقَارِئِ أن يستشعر مواقع آي القرآن من نفسه في ذات قلبه وفي أحوال نفسه وأعمال بدنه, etc. And the same idea that the qari, the individual, will find in the verses of the Quran, he'll find it منطبقا عليه, right, corresponding to him. خاصا به, as if it is, he says, حتى كأن جميعه لم ينزل إلا إليه. And therefore, the qari cannot say, ولا يقول إنما أنزل هذا في كذا. And here he's referring to what the mufassirin do, which is that أسباب النزول, right? This is a particular verse that is applicable to that particular case, etc. And the aim of this whole fahm at the end is تخلق بالقرآن, and he ends this risala by referring to the famous hadith of Aisha. سئلت عائشة رضي الله عنها عن خلق النبي فقالت كان خلقه القرآن. So the goal, the ultimate goal of fahm and tafahum is to basically be the embodiment of the Quran. I think I'm running out of time, but I would like to end with one example to see how what al-Ḥarāllī does with these ideas, with these qawaneen, as he calls them. Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the tafsir is lost. All we have is the quotations in al-Biqā'i's work. One example comes from the famous story of Jalut wa Talut, which is narrated in Surah Al-Baqarah. I won't go into the story because it's not so significant here, but what al-Ḥarāllī does is, in his commentary, which al-Biqā'i quotes quite faithfully, he begins by explaining, again, doing the tafsir, the i'rab, what it refers to. And then he mentions those who that there were of 3 categories, right? Those who drank from the river, those who didn't drink from the river at all, أولئك الذين ثبتوا وظنوا أنهم ملاقوا الله, and those who drank from the river, right? And then those who just took a gharfa, a little bit from the water, a handful, وهم الذين ثبتوا وتزلزلوا حتى ثبتهم الذين لم يطعموا. So one could say this, he could have just ended it there. That's the story. What does al-Ḥarāllī do? He says, oh, can you see this last slide? Okay, I think it's back. He says, وَلَمَّا كَانَ قَصَصُ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل مَثَلًا لِهَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ. And remember, مثال is the seventh harf, right? مثلا لهذه الأمة كان مبتلى هذه الأمة بالنهر ابتلاؤهم بنهر الدنيا الجاري خلالها، فكانت جيوشهم بحكم هذا الإيحاء الاعتباري إذا مروا بنهر أموال الناس وبلادهم وزروعهم وأقطارهم. Basically, he says that since the stories of Bani Israel are a method, are a type or an archetype for this ummah to learn from and to understand, that this reference to the story is al-Iḥā al-i'tibari. This is a gesture or reference of i'tibar. It invites contemplation. And he says you could read it as a reference to the actual events that happened. But then he says there's something deeper, which is what the Ummah of Muhammad understands or could understand. And he says, فَمَا كَانَ فِي بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ عَيَانًا, and that which occurred in Bani Israel, referring to a time frame, عَيَانًا, objectively, realistically, يَكُونُ وُقُوعُهُ فِي هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ اسْتِبْصَارًا, that it would reoccur in this ummah istibsaran, meaning for the sake of basira, of the sake of deeper understanding, right? And this is interesting that I think this is also what distinguishes him from other more batiniya or ishari, so-called ishariya mufassirin, that he does not deny the historicity of Bani Israel and what occurred, the Exodus and such events, or the punishments and so on. And he calls that ayyan, that it actually happened, that there's a fact. But when it happens in this ummah, it is for the sake of istibsar, for seeking a deeper understanding. Now, I will stop there, sharing the slide. And what al-Biqa'i does, there are two questions that I think scholars should engage with now. The first thing is, how did al-Biqa'i come across this work in Cairo? And secondly, what did al-Biqa'i do with this work? We have some answers to the second question, thanks to Walid's work, which is that he interpreted it as a program, he transformed the interest in i'tibar to a method by which one can actually go and read the biblical texts. Now, al-Ḥarāllī didn't do that. Al-Ḥarāllī actually never engages with biblical texts, although he refers frequently to biblical stories in the Qur'an. It was al-Biqa'i who builds on al-Ḥarāllī's understanding of the huruf and intibaq al-Qur'an, and translates that into a program. I think I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Islam. Really appreciate this detailed look at the output of Ḥarāllī, which in a sense, what's happening now, I think, in Islamic intellectual history is that we're really rediscovering what we would think is marginal, that is not marginal, and in a way, you know, what was is it the Annals history of like basically like the massacre of the cats, in a sense. We're really looking at these events that are minor but that are profoundly significant. Now, I do admit that my interaction with Ḥarāllī was simply to the degree that he affected Biqa'i. So I'm totally like, this is all new to me. You know, one doesn't have enough time to do all of this. And also the new book of on methods, I haven't seen it. So that's new, right? The new book by al-Khayyari or Khiyati.
Al-Khayyati's book, yeah, it's a few years. Yeah, it's been, I think it's 2018 or 19, but it hasn't really, it's published in Morocco. And it's by Rabat al-Muhammadiyya. Hasn't really circulated widely, but yeah, it's been out.
So actually, you know, you really, I wanna like go back to the question that you raised, in a sense. Like so what is the reception history of Ḥarāllī, in a sense? How did, like, because clearly he was a very controversial figure already in his lifetime, right? There's a myth that Ibn Abd al-Salam, Abu al-Izz bin Abd al-Salam kicked him out of Damascus or something, like, you know, and then, you know, the nasty remarks of Ibn Taymiyyah and the Dhahabi. But like, so like, is it true that only Biqa'i, like he was the only conduit to him was Biqa'i? What's your opinion on all this matter?
Thank you, Walid. Yeah, these are very important questions. The reception history. So it's really thanks to al-Biqa'i that we can, that we have at least the tafsir. The Rasail, I should have mentioned this, the Rasail do exist. We have copies of them. They have been edited. As I said, al-Biqa'i's own copy of the Rasail is today in Paris in the Bibliothèque Nationale, which shows that Biqa'i's library was scattered all over the place. We have books in Istanbul and Damascus and Princeton. I haven't come across quotations of al-Biqa'i, of al-Ḥarāllī's work in works other than al-Biqa'i. I haven't seen any quotations of his work. So he's mentioned quite a lot in the bibliographical dictionaries, but the problem there, as Faris Kayswood also discusses in his dissertation, that we have conflicting accounts because he traveled quite a lot. And so you have people who met him in Algeria, Bijaya, where he spent 5 years, and people who met him in Cairo, and others who only met him towards the end of his life. And so you have different accounts. The episode that you mentioned between him and Izz al-Din ibn Abd al-Salam, the famous Shafi'i jurist, and was at the time in Damascus and then later on in Cairo. And also an episode that is mentioned in the biographical dictionaries between him and Ibn Arabi. And it's interesting that they're all, in terms of the literary form or the type, they all end up with one of the two having to leave the city. Imma ana aw anta, right? There cannot be two great Sufis in the city. There cannot be Izz ibn Abd al-Salam and anyway, Faris Kayswood tries to offer an explanation for these, what these narratives might actually mean. And I agree with him that I think with regards to Izz al-Din ibn Abd al-Salam and Ibn Taymiyyah, I actually doubt that they read his tafsir or that they saw it. And they may have confused it with Ibn Arabi's work, who was there before al-Ḥarāllī. They were contemporaries. There is a lot of similarity in terms of interest in archetypes and so on, but they go in different directions. Ibn Taymiyyah, there's only one text that's mentioned by Dhahabi, and he says, وَكَانَ Ibn Taymiyyah يَحُطُّ عَلَيْهِ, right? That's all we know, that's all we have. What does that mean? that he did not think high of his work, and he said وَكَانَ مِنَ الْمُتَصَوِّفَ الْفَلَاسِفَ الْمُتَصَوِّفَ or something like that, philosophizing Sufis. But again, it's not clear to me whether any of these people actually saw the tafsir. And what makes this research fascinating and really a puzzle is that al-Biqai, the very same Biqai, wrote, as we all know, wrote really harsh pieces against the Sufi establishment in Cairo, against the followers of Ibn Farid and Ibn Arabi. Yet he celebrates al-Ḥarāllī, right? He celebrates this method. So there's a lot of seeming paradoxes that we have to think about, right? And in his defense of his tafsir, which you edited, al-Aqwal al-Qawima fi hukm al-kutub min al-naql min kutub al-qadima, one of the arguments that al-Biqai cites in defense of his practice was Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion that the corruption, textual corruption, is exegetical, and that actual tampering with the scriptures was very, very limited. And he uses Ibn Taymiyyah's arguments in order to justify his practice of citing the biblical text. Now, whether he was doing this apologetically in I don't know, that requires closer reading. But so all of these different elements really blur the lines that we are accustomed to, the Sufis against the traditionists. And you find actually he himself was a traditionalist in certain circles, a hadith scholar, but then he's engaging with the Ḥarāllī, which is causing him significant trouble, right?
Thank you so much. I think now we'll open the floor for questions, and I could see now that already in the chat